I have filed 2,847 administrative forms in 11 years as Corridor Administrator for the Vethara Resettlement Authority, 7th Passage District. I have filed intake manifests and population transfers and decommissioning notices and water reclamation audits, and 17 separate complaints about the calibration drift on my deep scanner array, each complaint acknowledged and none ever acted upon. I have filed forms in triplicate that were never read, forms in duplicate that contradicted each other, and forms in a single copy that I kept because no one told me who was supposed to receive the original. I have filed forms at 02:00 station time because a deadline crossed a shift boundary, and there was no one to hand them off to, and I have filed forms during the mandatory quarterly evacuation drill, because the drill does not suspend administrative obligations, and the forms do not care about drills. I have filed forms that I knew contained errors, and I have filed corrections to those forms. And on 2 occasions I have filed corrections to the corrections, which is a category of document that the Vethara Resettlement Authority's procedural guide acknowledges in a footnote and declines to address in any further detail, presumably because the people who wrote the guide did not want to imagine a world in which it was necessary. I have filed forms when I did not know what I was filing them for, filling in fields with the best approximation I had available, submitting them into queues that disappeared into the administrative structure above me and returned, if they returned at all, as acknowledgement notices with reference numbers that did not correspond to any numbering scheme I could find in the registry guide. I have filed forms that were the wrong form for the situation, knowing they were the wrong form, because the right form did not exist, and the wrong form was the closest available shape for what I needed to express. The distress beacon was Form VRA 7 Colonial Escort Request, standard issue, 4 pages. I have kept a blank copy in my desk drawer since the first week of my appointment here, in the same drawer as the Supplementary Reference Guide and the Emergency Protocol Binder and the Communications Frequency Catalog, because I like my tools in one place. In 11 years, the drawer has become one of the most organized things in this district, which is something I think about when I need to think about something I control. I filed the VRA 7 the same way I file everything else in this corridor, carefully, without expectation, into whatever void the bureaucracy points me toward when I have done everything I know how to do, and nothing I have done has been enough. I was not expecting 11,400 warships. I want to be precise about what the 7th Passage District was when I filed the beacon, because precision is the tool I was trained on, and precision is the only tool I have that reliably does what I ask of it when I ask it under conditions I was not prepared for. The 7th Passage District is a resettlement corridor. 9 inhabited stations and 4 transit platforms strung along a 4.7 light-hour arc in the outer margin of Vethara territorial space, which is itself not a phrase that inspires confidence when said aloud, in the same way that outer margin of territorial space is not a phrase that inspires confidence when said aloud. And the combination of the two produces a description that accurately conveys what it felt like to administer this district before the Dravathi arrived, which is to say, exposed, distant, under-resourced, and formally documented. Vethara territorial space is administered space, not defended space. We do not have a military in the way that military is usually meant. We have the Vethara Resettlement Authority, which is a civilian administrative body that manages population movements from overstressed inner systems to developing outer ones. And we have a set of bilateral agreements with various regional military powers that theoretically entitle corridor administrators to request armed escort through contested transit lanes when the situation warrants it. And we have Form VRA 7, which is 4 pages and has a field for describing the nature of the threat, and a field for estimating the number of vessels required, and a field for certifying that the requesting administrator has exhausted other available remediation options, which is a field I have always found faintly insulting, because it implies that a district administrator with adequate other options would be using the VRA-7 rather than the other options, which describes no district administrator I have ever met. The Vethara are not a martial species. We are administrators. We classify, we document, we route. We have been routing resettlement populations through this corridor for 61 years, because the inner Vethara systems reached carrying capacity 61 years ago, and the appropriate governing bodies decided that the correct response was to designate new outer corridors rather than address the underlying demographic structure, which would have required different forms than anyone at any relevant organizational level was prepared to file, and would have produced conclusions about resource allocation and population management that would have been accurate and uncomfortable, and would have required someone to take responsibility for implementing them, which is a combination of qualities that tends to produce inaction in any bureaucratic system I have studied. So the 7th Passage District was commissioned and staffed with people like me, and the populations came in quarterly transfers on scheduled transports, and the stations accumulated their residents and their records and their maintenance backlogs and their supply shortfalls. And for 52 years, the corridor functioned within the normal administrative parameters of a healthy outer resettlement district, which is to say it functioned within parameters that were technically acceptable and practically difficult, and that no one in the inner system offices was particularly motivated to improve. Then the Dravathi continuance began folding the geometry around us, and everything I had documented so carefully started to come apart in a way that I had no classification language for and no form to describe accurately. I should explain the Dravathi, because the 9 weeks I spent documenting their incursion before I filed the beacon were the most technically demanding period of my professional life, and because the documentation I produced was, I have since come to understand, inadequate to what was actually occurring in ways that I find professionally embarrassing, even though the inadequacy was not my fault in any way I can specifically identify. The Dravathi continuance does not fight wars the way other species fight wars. They have no armada. They have no warships in any conventional classification I have access to. They have no directed energy systems, no kinetic delivery arrays, no boarding protocols, no close engagement doctrine of any kind. What they have is an understanding of space that is approximately 300 years more sophisticated than ours in this region, and they use that understanding the way a hydrologist uses a watershed system, not to cut directly through the terrain, but to find where the pressure gradient already favors movement and to redirect it fractionally, and let the existing structure do the work over time, without any single dramatic event that would constitute a declaration of intent in the way that conventional military action constitutes a declaration of intent. What they were doing to the 7th Passage District was folding transit lanes, not closing them, not blockading them with physical assets, folding them, introducing a deliberate spatial pleat, a controlled distortion of the local metric, so that the corridor segment still appeared to occupy the same spatial address it had always occupied, still registered as open and navigable on standard navigational charts, still answered route planning queries with the correct coordinates and the correct listed distances. A ship approaching a folded lane would see nothing irregular on its instruments. The lane would appear to be exactly what it had always been. The ship would enter at the expected coordinates, follow the expected heading, and emerge at the far end having traveled significantly further than its instruments indicated, because the space itself had been lengthened without any external marker of the change, folded like a piece of material that looks the same from the outside but has an extra layer tucked inside, invisible to any standard measurement. That does not account for the fact that the measurement itself is being taken through a distorted metric. Most ships arrived critically short on fuel. The Dravathi would then initiate a collection aperture, a secondary fold connecting the arrival point to wherever the Dravathi chose to redirect the ship, and the vessel would be gone, not destroyed, relocated, moved to whatever spatial address the Dravathi considered appropriate for a ship that had wandered into space they were in the process of making their own, in the way that everything the Dravathi folded space around became, eventually, theirs. The ships did not come back. The crews did not transmit distress signals in time, because by the time they understood what had happened the aperture was already open, and there was nothing to transmit to. The transit lanes looked clear on every instrument I operated. Ships kept entering them. I kept filing missing vessel reports for ships that had entered lanes my instruments showed as navigable and had not arrived at their destinations. I want to dwell on what those 9 weeks felt like as an administrative experience, because I think it matters for understanding the state I was in when I filed the beacon. The Dravathi's methodology is not designed to be dramatic. It does not announce itself. There is no moment of clarity in which the situation becomes obviously a military emergency rather than an accumulating series of logistical anomalies. You notice, over time, that your missing vessel reports are clustering, and then you notice that the clusters are correlated with specific transit lanes, and then you notice that the lanes themselves are charting correctly while simultaneously producing results consistent with lanes that are not correct. And by the time you have understood what this means, you are already 9 weeks into an incursion that you have been documenting as a series of technical malfunctions. I received 4 responses to my missing vessel reports in 9 weeks. 2 were acknowledgement notices with reference numbers. 1 was a request for additional documentation that I had already provided. 1 was a notification that the cases had been transferred to a different administrative queue and that I would receive a response within 90 to 120 days. None of them indicated that anyone in the administrative chain above me had recognized the pattern I was seeing, and none of them asked me any of the questions I would have asked if I had been receiving reports of this kind from a district administrator below me. I was not below anyone in the administrative chain who had the authority to do what was needed and the information to know it was needed at the same time. This is a condition that occurs in bureaucratic structures, and there is a form for reporting it, and I filed the form, and the form acknowledged that the condition had been reported and that it would be reviewed within the standard review window. The survey crew's report on day 22 was the first piece of information I received from any external source that matched what I was observing. Not a form response, not an acknowledgement. A technical report from specialists who had recognized a Dravathi fold and come back to say so. I have thought often about what that moment felt like, reading a document that confirmed what I had been unable to say clearly in any form I had access to, and I have concluded that it felt mostly like relief. Not the relief that the problem was solved. The relief that the problem had words. Once a problem has words, you can file the appropriate form for it. On day 14, I requested a technical consultation on fuel consumption variance from the Vethara Scientific Advisory Service, because the survey vessel tracking data showed ships leaving with full fuel and not arriving, which is not a pattern that has a standard administrative explanation. The advisory service acknowledged my request on day 26, which was 2 days after the survey vessel returned with the answer. The survey crew were spatial metric specialists. They had recognized the fold signature with instruments calibrated specifically for metric irregularity, and they had navigated back through the fleet at significant cost to their fuel reserves. They arrived with approximately 4% remaining, which is a margin I do not want to think about in terms of what 4% remaining means for a crew that understood every moment of the return transit, how close to not arriving they were. They filed their technical report with me directly, because they were not certain which other authority had jurisdiction over what they had found. I read the report. I read it twice. I cross-referenced their terminology against the Vethara Scientific Advisory Service's supplementary document on non-standard spatial phenomena, which I had requested as background reading on day 7, and which had arrived 42 pages long, and which I had read in full by day 14, because that is how I have always operated, and because the situation had not yet produced anything that gave me reason to believe that thorough reading would be insufficient preparation. On day 23, I filed Form VRA 7. I want to be completely honest about what I expected, because the honesty matters for understanding what came next. The Vethara Resettlement Authority's standard response to a VRA 7 from a district administrator of my tenure is to acknowledge receipt within 10 to 14 working days and dispatch a single armed escort frigate within 90 to 120 days from acknowledgement. I had filed a VRA 7 once before, in my 4th year of service, for a different transit disruption, and I had received acknowledgement on day 13 and a frigate on day 106. The frigate arrived to find the disruption had self-resolved. It inspected the lanes, confirmed they were navigable, and departed. I filed a resolution notice, noted the timeline in my records, and returned to my normal administrative routine. I filed the VRA 7 on day 23, knowing the frigate would arrive too late or not at all. I filed it because there is a form for this situation. Administrators file the appropriate forms. Filing the form creates a record, and the record is sometimes all that survives to explain to whoever comes after what happened and why. I have never stopped believing this, even in situations where the record is clearly going to outlast me. The Dravathi folded a 5th transit lane on day 31 and a 6th on day 44. By day 44, 6 of the 8 active transit lanes in the district were pleated into geometric distances that made them impassable without fuel reserves that no standard resettlement transport carried. I had suspended the quarterly transfer cycle on day 31, before the 6th fold, because the risk to incoming transports was not one I could accept without explicit authorization from a supervisory level. I could not reach quickly enough to be useful. The 18,000 residents of the 9 stations and 4 platforms were adequately supplied for the medium term, but they were not going anywhere, and the 2 remaining open lanes connected to outer relay points rather than inter-system access, which meant that even the available routes did not connect to anyone who could help. On the morning of day 63, my scanner registered fold preparation signatures on transit lane 7. The preparation signature is a specific pattern of metric stress fractures that I had learned over 9 weeks to recognize in its early stages, and I recognized this one quickly, and I recognized what it meant. After transit lane 7, 1 open lane remained. After that lane folded, the corridor would be geometrically sealed from every direction that mattered. I was watching the preparation signature and composing my standard fold event log entry when I filed Form VRA 7, both simultaneously because administrators learn to do multiple things at once when the circumstances require it. I transmitted the beacon at 14:07 station time on day 63, standard colonial frequency, 4 pages. The number of vessels requested, 1, as the form's guidance suggested. At 14:31 station time, 24 minutes after transmission, my deep scanner array registered a fold echo that did not match any entry in my supplementary reference guide. I have 340 pages of supplementary reference material. I have read it 3 times. I know it well enough to navigate it quickly. I cross-checked the echo signature against every classification in the guide in approximately 11 minutes, which is faster than I have ever cross-checked anything, because the echo was unlike anything I had seen in 9 weeks of Dravathi fold monitoring, and I needed to know what I was looking at. The Dravathi fold signature is smooth and progressive, the spatial metric moving under steady controlled pressure, the way a membrane moves when pushed slowly and evenly from one side. The distortion building from a baseline to a peak in a curve I could now recognize in the first moments of any new event. What my scanner returned at 14:31 was the precise inverse, the signature of extreme compression releasing instantaneously, a membrane that had been held at a fraction of its natural volume, suddenly expanding outward at once. Not a spatial event in progress. The aftershock of a spatial event that had just completed. The metric normalizing around whatever had just stopped compressing itself into a much smaller space. I logged at SC2847 under an inadequate classification and was composing the notation when the second echo arrived. Then the third. Then 17 overlapping echoes in 4 seconds, all of the same character, spatially distributed across the outer corridor margin in a pattern that suggested multiple simultaneous decompression events rather than a single source. Then my scanner began producing numbers outside every category in the supplementary guide, and I transmitted a technical support query at 14:35 that the regional desk acknowledged 11 days later. The fold echoes continued for 41 minutes. I monitored continuously, logging each return, assigning reference numbers to readings I could not classify, maintaining the record that was going to be all that anyone could reconstruct this from if reconstruction was all that remained possible. I know now what the 41 minutes contained. When the pale Armada transits collectively, all 11,400 hulls in a single compressed transit packet, they compress the space around themselves into a transit volume far smaller than standard space. Not a fold in the Dravathi sense, not a controlled pleat of the local metric. A compression space made smaller around the fleet moving through that smaller space at velocities that are not meaningful in standard spatial terms, and then the compression releasing at destination. The release produces a bloom of spatial distortion, approximately 190,000 kilometers across that takes 41 minutes to normalize, as the compressed volume expands back to standard configuration. My scanner was reading that normalization. It was reading the shape of the space the pale Armada had just finished being inside. At 15:15 station time, the scanner returned to producing coherent classified data. 3 seconds of familiar corridor margin readings. Then the ships resolved into the display. I have tried in the 31 days since to write a description of this that satisfies me as an account of what I actually saw, and I have not succeeded. The difficulty is structural. I am attempting to use administrative language to describe something that administrative language was not built to contain, and every time I try to adapt the language to the scale of the subject, I find that either the language fails or the scale fails, and I cannot make them fit each other without losing something that seems important. I will try anyway. The formation resolved before the individual ships did. My scanner showed density gradients first, regions of the outer corridor margin, where hull return signals were clustering, separated by intervals of lower density, the pattern too regular to be instrument error, and too large for my display to render at the resolution required to distinguish individual hulls without scaling the display to 3 times its standard survey range. I scaled the display. The density gradients resolved into rings. Ovoid rings, their major axis aligned along the corridor axis, each ring separated from its neighbors by a consistent interval that spoke of precise, deliberate spacing. The whole arrangement was oriented in the direction of the district's interior, which meant the formation had a front, and what the front was facing was the space I was sitting in. The hulls resolved out of the rings over several minutes. They were white. I want to try to say this precisely because the white is not incidental detail, not paint white, not designation white, not the white of any applied coating or surface treatment. The white of long service in hard vacuum, the color that structural alloys acquire when the manufactured surface layers have shed over decades of hard use, and what remains beneath is the base material, the structural metal that the hull is actually made of, pale and dense, and stable in a way that applied coatings never quite achieve, because applied coatings are always fighting the environment whereas base alloy has already made its peace with it. Every hull I could resolve in adequate detail showed this surface character, and each hull's white was specific to its own history. The accumulated marks of its own engagements and repairs and field modifications, the specific pattern of impact damage and plating replacement and thermal scarring that constituted that hull's individual biography. But all of them shared the fundamental quality. They had been in space for a very long time, and they had been doing difficult things there, and the doing of difficult things over a very long time had brought them to this particular pallor. The formation held perfectly through the entire resolution, not the kind of perfectly that a fleet achieves when the spacing is within acceptable margins and the commander declares it satisfactory. The kind of perfectly that exists because maintaining precise position relative to one's neighbors is not an achievement these ships are aiming at, but a baseline property of how they move, something structural rather than aspirational, arising from 6 centuries of formation-keeping refinement, rather than from any given day's coordination effort. The inner rings held the ICV opened hand, the last hull to settle into position. I read the size estimation 3 times, applying correction factors for each of the scanner's 17 documented calibration biases. The corrected number was 17.2 kilometers. I checked the display scale key. The scale was correctly set. I set the scanner to its backup size estimation mode, which uses a different calculation method and which has different error characteristics, and ran the estimation again. The backup mode returned 17.1 kilometers. The ICV opened hand was 17.2 kilometers long. It settled into the formation center with the unhurried deliberateness of something that knows where it is going and does not need to hurry, moving through space the way large things move when they are confident of their mass, not quickly, but with the complete certainty of arrival. The hull's surface was the most densely marked of anything I was looking at, not randomly scarred, stratified, scorch marks layered over older scorch marks, the chemistry of each layer distinct from the layers above and below it. Repair plating installed over older repair plating over the original alloy, each generation of repair leaving a record of the damage that necessitated it, the record legible in the striations the way geological strata are legible in a cliff face. There were weapon aperture clusters along the dorsal surface. I counted 47 before the count became meaningless as a number, and the aperture housings showed the same layered history as the hull plating, which meant the weapon systems had been rebuilt multiple times, and the rebuilding had left marks that subsequent use had scarred over, and subsequent rebuilding had partially covered. The hull was an archive of 614 years of service, and the service had not been gentle, and the hull had survived all of it. It settled into position and was still. I want to try to convey what looking at the formation did to my sense of administrative proportion, because I think this is relevant to understanding everything that came after. I had spent 11 years developing a finely calibrated sense of scale for this corridor. I knew the distance between every station. I knew the transit times on every lane under every standard fuel load condition. I knew the weight of a quarterly population transfer, the number of forms it generated, the time required to process those forms, the variance between planned and actual arrival schedules, and what that variance meant for station supply management. I had a detailed working model of this corridor in my head, precise enough that when something happened I could usually tell within a few minutes whether it was significant or routine. The formation the pale Armada was holding had a width, at its outermost ring, of approximately 180,000 kilometers. The 4.7 light-hour arc of the 7th Passage District is approximately 5 billion kilometers. The formation occupied approximately 3.6% of the district's linear span, which sounds modest until you consider that the stations themselves are distributed across that arc, with spacings measured in the hundreds of millions of kilometers, and that the formation's 180.0-kilometer width was larger than the distance between stations 4 and 5, which are the most closely spaced pair in the district at 141,000 kilometers. The formation was wider than the gap between two stations. I processed this fact in the administrative way I process all facts, nodding it, recording it, fitting it into the model, and my model did not have adequate resolution for it. The ICV opened hand specifically was 17.2 kilometers. This station is 340 meters across at its widest point. 50 of this station, end to end, would equal approximately 17 kilometers. I have been in this station for 11 years, and I have a thorough understanding of its spatial dimensions, having navigated all of them multiple times, and having filed the maintenance records for every section of them. 50 of this station, end to end, fitted inside the length of the ICV opened hand with room to spare. Not one of the 11,400 hulls in the formation transmitted a hail. I transmitted my own hail at 15, 23, all 17 colonial frequencies and all 11 military advisory frequencies. No response. A second hail referencing my VRA-7, asking whether the formation was connected to that request. No response. I was beginning a third when the Dravathi made their opening move. At 16:02 station time, my scanner registered a fold event initiating in the outer corridor margin, not at a transit lane, at the formation, at the spatial region the pale Armada occupied. In 9 weeks of documented Dravathi incursion activity, not one fold event had failed to complete once initiated. I have the scanner logs. Every fold the Dravathi began in 9 weeks ran to completion. The geometry was altered, the fold stabilized, and the alteration persisted independently of the infrastructure that had created it. A Dravathi fold, once started, became a permanent feature of the local spatial landscape. That was not a generalization from limited evidence. That was what the data showed, consistently, across every observation I had recorded. The fold event at 16:02 stopped at 9 seconds. At 16:02 and 41 seconds, the ICV opened hand maneuvered to intersect the fold boundary's active margin, the transitional region where the spatial metric was still in motion, still in the process of being altered, the place where the fold was being made rather than having been made, and fired into that margin. I will explain what I subsequently came to understand about what this meant, with the caveat that my understanding is incomplete and the technical details are classified above my clearance level. A Dravathi fold event during its active phase creates a geometric connection between the fold boundary and the fold node generating it. The fold node is the infrastructure anchoring the event, the physical structure that produces the metric distortion. Before the fold stabilizes into a self-sustaining configuration that no longer requires the node to maintain it, there is a path, not through standard space, but through the altered topology itself, through the geometry of the fold, connecting the active boundary to the node. The ordnance from the ICV opened hands weapons systems traveled that path and emerged at the node. The node was destroyed. The fold event, deprived of its generating node before the configuration had stabilized, collapsed. The spatial pleat the Dravathi had been initiating unwound in approximately 4 seconds. At 16:02 and 52 seconds, the corridor margin was standard space. I sat at my console and I completed my incident log entry. I stared at what I had written. I had noted the fold event initiation at 16:02. I had noted the collapse at 16:02 and 52 seconds. I had noted that the collapse had occurred before completion, which was a condition that had no precedent in 9 weeks of documented observation. The classification field contained the best available entry, which was inadequate. The Dravathi tried again at 16:09. Different node, different sector, different approach vector. The ICV opened hand fired at 16:09 and 38 seconds. The event collapsed at 16:09 and 51, 13 seconds total. Third attempt at 16:17, 12 seconds to collapse. Fourth attempt at 16:26, 8 seconds. By the fourth attempt, I understood the decreasing interval. The Pale Armada's targeting systems were learning. Each fold event provided data on the Dravathi fold network's geometry, the node's location, its characteristics, the topology of the fold connection it generated. The more events the Dravathi initiated, the more complete the targeting picture became, and the faster subsequent solutions ran. Every attack was simultaneously a lesson delivered to the adversary on the structure of the attacker's own infrastructure. The Dravathi had no alternative. You do not develop secondary methodologies when your primary methodology has worked without exception for 3 centuries. You refine the primary methodology and you continue to apply it, because every piece of operational evidence in your history confirms that it works, and no piece of evidence suggests it might stop working. And you have no category for evidence of the kind that would change this assessment, because that kind of evidence has never existed in any space you have operated in. The 18,000 people in this district will not, in the ordinary course of their resettlement process, know in any detail what occurred in the 2 days of the Pale Armada's presence. They experienced a period of transit disruption, followed by a resumption of transit. The scanner data and incident logs and administrative records exist, and are technically accessible through the standard public filing system. But navigating those records requires the kind of patience with bureaucratic document structures that most people do not have, and that most people should not need to develop for the purpose of understanding what protected them. I have given 3 informal briefings to station leadership councils since the engagement. The councils asked practical questions. When will the transit lanes be restored? When will the quarterly transfer cycle resume? Is there ongoing threat? What is the status of missing ships from the incursion period? I answered accurately and completely. I described the Pale Armada in response to a direct question from the council chair of Station 6, who had seen the scanner returns during the engagement and wanted to know what she had been looking at. I told her. She sat with the information for a moment and then asked whether that was going to happen again, meaning the incursion, not the response. And I told her that I did not know and that I had established monitoring protocols, and that I was in ongoing contact with the administrative chain about the situation. I did not mention that my ongoing contact with the administrative chain had produced no responses. It was not a relevant detail for the purpose of that briefing. I filed an accurate record of the briefing, and noted in the follow-up section that the population had questions about incident recurrence risk, and that I had answered with the information available to me. The Dravathi continuance had no file on the Pale Armada. How could they? The Pale Armada had not operated in this region of space. No species capable of creating such a file had survived an encounter with the Pale Armada long enough to circulate the information. The Dravathi saw 11,400 ships in standard space and did what they had done to every other obstacle in 3 centuries. They initiated a fold, and then another, and then 31 more over the course of an afternoon and a brief period the following morning, each one providing a cleaner targeting solution than the last, each one bringing the comprehensive map of their fold network 1 data point closer to completion. Between 1602 and 1740, 31 fold events. Everyone converted. Everyone collapsed before completion. I logged each event and each collapse with the same careful precision I had brought to 9 weeks of Dravathi monitoring. I want to try to describe what logging 31 fold events and their collapses in real time felt like, because I think the experience itself is part of what I observed. The first several events I logged with the full care I bring to all significant incident records, precise timestamps, spatial coordinates, classification codes, notes on each event's character and the nature of its collapse. By the 10th event, I had developed a shorthand, a compressed version of the entry format that captured the essential data in fewer keystrokes, because the events were coming fast enough that full format entries were producing a lag in my record. By the 20th event, the shorthand had become automatic, my hands producing the entries while my attention remained on the scanner display. Watching the next event initiate, and the next solution execute, and the next collapse occur before I had finished logging the previous one. What I remember most clearly from those 98 minutes between 16:02 and 17:40 is not the events themselves. I have the records. The events are documented. What I remember is the texture of the period, the specific quality of watching something systematic occur with no apparent upper limit on the number of iterations, while being simultaneously responsible for maintaining a record of each iteration, and uncertain whether the record would ever be complete or whether the iterations would simply continue indefinitely. Administrative work at scale produces a kind of suspended consciousness, a state of detailed attention that is not quite normal attention, because it is allocated entirely to the task rather than to any wider awareness of what the task is for. I was in that state for most of those 98 minutes. I was logging fold event collapses, and I was not, in any meaningful sense, thinking about what the fold event collapses meant. I was just logging them. I understood what they meant afterward. In the moment, I was logging. Because the log is the record, and the record is what exists after everything else is over. At 17:40, the fold event stopped. The background fold distortion I had been operating against for 9 weeks, the low-level spatial static that I had incorporated into my baseline understanding of this district's operating environment the way you incorporate any persistent environmental condition, until you forget it was not always there, was simply absent. I had not realized how thoroughly I had incorporated it until it was gone, and the scanner was reading the corridor as standard space, and I understood, in a way that I could not have understood while I was inside it, how different the two conditions were. 3 attempts at 1822, rapid sequence, then silence for the remainder of the station day. I slept 4 hours spread across 12, monitoring between. The pale Armada held formation through the dark cycle without movement. At 07:14 station time on day 64, the Dravathi committed their entire remaining infrastructure to a final attempt. The fold preparation signature appeared simultaneously across the full 4.7 light-hour arc of the 7th Passage District. Not a transit lane, not a corridor segment, everything. Every spatial address in the district simultaneously showing the metric stress fractures that precede a fold event. The Dravathi were attempting to fold the entire corridor, all of it at once, 9 stations and 4 platforms and 11,400 warships and 1 corridor administrator and 18,000 Vethara resettlement population residents, into whatever spatial address the Dravathi intended to make this space once it was fully theirs. A fold at this scale required 11 coordinated fold nodes operating in synchronized sequence, the largest fold infrastructure commitment I had recorded in 9 weeks of observation. The clear full deployment of whatever regional fold capacity had been assigned to the 7th Passage District incursion. Every node the Dravathi had available for this operation committed simultaneously, generating a fold boundary encompassing the full district. 11 nodes, 11 simultaneous connections between the fold boundary's active margins and the infrastructure generating them, 11 simultaneous targeting paths. The fold boundary initiated at 07:14. At 07:14 and 31 seconds, the expansion array opened. The formation repositioned, all 11,400 hulls moving to the firing configuration simultaneously, the hull return density on my scanner blooming outward from the formation center as each ship found its new calculated position, and 11 firing solutions executed simultaneously, ordnance traveling through 11 fold connections at once. 17 seconds. The fold boundary existed for 17 seconds. The 11 fold nodes were gone. The 2.1 light-hour compression attempt from the previous day's largest single event had collapsed in 17 seconds. This one, 6 times larger, 11 times more complex, the full commitment of Dravathi fold infrastructure in this region of space, collapsed in the same 17 seconds, because the size of the fold event changes the magnitude of the attack, but not the fundamental vulnerability that the attack creates. And the Pale Armada's weapons do not become less effective as the event becomes larger. If anything, they become more effective, because a larger event requires more infrastructure, and more infrastructure means more targeting solutions, and more targeting solutions means more things destroyed simultaneously. The normalization of 11 simultaneous collapsed fold boundaries produced 4 minutes of metric interference on my scanner display. The normalization waves crossing each other, the intersections rendering as static, the scanner working through the interference pattern until it resolved back to clean readings. When it cleared, the corridor was standard space. The full 4.7 light-hour arc, standard metric throughout. The 5 stable transit lane folds from the first weeks of the incursion remained. Those folds had completed and stabilized before the Pale Armada arrived, and the nodes generating them had not been among the 11 targeted, but every active fold infrastructure directed at this corridor was gone. At 0731, the Pale Armada departed. The departure bloom was smaller and faster than the arrival transit compression rather than decompression, inward rather than outward, and my scanner registered it in approximately 90 seconds. 11,400 hull returns, present on the display at 0730, absent at 0731. The formation was gone. 1 frigate remained. ICV Pale Watch, 340 meters, iron gray hull bearing the same H pallor as everything else I had been looking at for the past 17 hours. Broadcasting an identification signal on the military advisory frequency beginning at 0733. Positioned in the outer corridor margin at approximately the location where I had imagined, on day 23 when I filed Form VRA-7, that a single armed escort frigate might sit. Here was the escort I had requested. I transmitted a hail. The hail, as recorded in my communications log, represents the clearest departure from formal administrative language that I have produced in 11 years of service, and I reproduce it here without editing, because I think the departure is part of the record and the record should be accurate. ICV Pale Watch. This is Corridor Administrator Orith Sanval, Vethara Resettlement Authority, 7th Passage District, filing a follow-up to Form VRA-7 Colonial Escort request transmitted at 14:07 station time yesterday. I need to file a formal inquiry about the response received to that form, and I need to address it correctly, which requires knowing who authorized the response. I would also appreciate knowing whether there is a different form I should have used, because if the situation ever repeats, I would prefer to file the correct form from the beginning rather than the nearest available approximation. The ICV Pale Watch did not respond. I understand now that the Pale Armada's communication protocols do not include responding to civilian administrative hails from corridor administrators. I understand that the ICV Pale Watch's presence in the outer corridor margin is its complete communication, and the communication is, the escort you requested is here. 1 ship, the number requested, at the location needed. The form asked for 1 escort and 1 escort is present and on station. The other 11,399 were the Pale Armada's interpretation of what the situation behind the form required, and the Pale Armada does not explain its interpretations. I filed formal inquiries through every channel available to me, the standard colonial relay, all 11 military advisory frequencies, the Vethara Resettlement Authority administrative chain at 3 distinct organizational levels, the regional desk and the sector desk, and the authority-level coordination office, which is not a channel I have ever used before because it is the channel you use when you are escalating past every intermediate level, and I had never previously had a situation that felt like it required that. The Vethara Scientific Advisory Service. The Vethara Territorial Coordination Office. 2 frequency bands in a supplementary appendix to my communications library, dated 32 years ago, whose original designated purpose I could not determine from the context notes, but which appeared to be inter-authority coordination channels of some historic designation that might or might not still route to anyone capable of responding. I composed each inquiry carefully, in formal administrative language, noting the VRA-7 transmission details and the response received, and my request for identification of the authorizing body and clarification of the appropriate form for future requests. None of the inquiries has been answered. 31 days. The response queues are empty. I check each morning. The ICV Pale Watch broadcasts its identification signal every 4 hours, as regular as a calibrated instrument, more regular than most of the instruments I actually operate. ICV Pale Watch, position confirmed, hull integrity nominal, standing orders active. Every 4 hours without variation. I log each broadcast in my incident record. The entry takes approximately 20 seconds. It is the most reliable event in my administrative day, which is something I find harder to explain to people who have not operated aging equipment in an underfunded outer corridor for 11 years than I would like. The 5 folded transit lanes are being addressed. The Vethara Scientific Advisory Service has assigned a technical restoration team, arrival estimated within 60 days, which is substantially faster than the advisory service has responded to any technical request I have made in 11 years. I believe this is related to the scope and detail of the incident report I submitted alongside the restoration request, which was 31 pages and which I spent 4 days writing, because I wanted it to be as complete and as accurate as anything I have ever filed. I do not know if they read all 31 pages. I know they responded within 4 days. The 18,000 residents of the 9 stations and 4 platforms are present and accounted for. Transit on the 2 unfolded northern relay lanes resumed 3 days ago. The quarterly resettlement transfer cycle remains suspended pending full lane restoration. In my daily administrative reports, the 7th Passage District is a corridor in managed recovery from a resolved territorial incursion. The incursion is resolved. The population is stable. The restoration timeline is established. I am managing within acceptable parameters. In my incident log, the 7th Passage District is the corridor where 11,400 warships answered a Form VRA-7, requesting 1 escort frigate, and 1 frigate stayed, and 31 days of follow-up inquiries to every channel I have access to have produced no response from any authorizing body or coordinating office. And I do not know who sent the Pale Armada, or who to file a formal acknowledgement of service with, or whether the form for that even exists. I have been thinking about what it means that the Pale Armada arrived 24 minutes after I transmitted the beacon. 24 minutes. The Vethara Resettlement Authority Regional Relay at Orvath Station is approximately 11.3 light hours from the 7th Passage District. At the speed of a standard colonial transmission, my beacon required approximately 11 hours and 18 minutes to reach Orvath Station. The standard administrative chain from Orvath Station to the authority-level desk that would process a VRA-7 requires, under normal routing conditions, between 2 and 6 hours. The standard dispatch timeline after processing begins is 90 to 120 days. None of these timelines produce an arrival of 24 minutes from transmission. The only conclusion I have been able to reach, and I have spent a substantial portion of my available thinking time in the past 31 days working through the available conclusions, is that the Pale Armada was not responding to my beacon. They were already moving. They were already committed to a destination that was, or that became, this corridor before my VRA-7 reached any relay. They had information about the 7th Passage District incursion, that I had not provided to them through any channel I had access to. And they had that information early enough to be in transit while I was still composing my incident log entries. The monitoring infrastructure I cannot identify. I filed a request for information about it on day 4 after the engagement. I filed a follow-up on day 12. Both remain in the response queue, which is empty. I want to record, for the sake of accuracy, what the 24-minute arrival means for how I think about my own role in what happened. I had been operating for 9 weeks on the understanding that the VRA-7 was the only action available to me that might produce a response, and that the response, if it came, would be a single escort frigate arriving in 90 to 120 days. I had filed the form knowing this. I had filed it as a record-keeping action as much as a request action, because the record would exist whether or not the frigate arrived in time. If the Pale Armada was not responding to my beacon, if they were already moving, already tracking the situation, already committed before I transmitted anything, then my VRA-7 did not produce the response. The response was already in progress. I filed the form in the 24th minute of an arrival that had been underway since some point before I filed anything, and the arrival was 24 minutes from my transmission, because 24 minutes from my transmission was when it completed, not because my transmission triggered it. This is an administratively disorienting conclusion. I filed the form because filing the form was what I could do. I had no way of knowing that something else was already occurring. The form is in the record. The record shows that I filed the VRA-7 at 14:07 and that 11,400 warships arrived at 15:15. The record, read by someone who does not know what I know, implies causation. I want the record to also reflect that I am not certain causation is what the record actually shows. I mention this not because I think it changes anything practically. The corridor is quiet regardless of what caused it to become quiet, but because accurate documentation is the only tool I have that reliably does what I ask of it, and accuracy requires acknowledging the limits of what I know. I have been thinking, in the available time between my standard administrative duties, about what form VRA-7 actually communicates to a reader with sufficient context to understand it. The form asks, where is the corridor? What is the disruption? How long has it lasted? What is the nature of the threat? A reader with adequate knowledge of the threat type does not read those fields as a request for a specific quantity of naval vessels. They read them as a description of a situation, and the situation has its own requirements that do not necessarily correspond to what the requesting administrator has written in the quantity field, because the requesting administrator is making an estimate based on what they know, and what a district corridor administrator with no military background knows about appropriate force deployment against a physics-bending civilization is precisely nothing. The Pale Armada was built for physics-bending adversaries, not incidentally, not as a secondary capability developed over time, built for them specifically, deliberately, as the primary purpose of a force that has been in continuous service for 614 years. I have found fragmentary references to the history of this in the Vethara Scientific Advisory Services Archive of Non-Vethara Military Documentation, which is not a comprehensive archive. The advisory service is not a military institution, but which contains enough to understand the broad shape. Humanity encountered a fold space adversary at some point approximately 3 centuries before the ICV Opened Hands Commission date, and the encounter required a response that humanity's existing forces could not give, and humanity built something in response, and the something has been the Pale Armada ever since. The Dravathi continuance had no file on the Pale Armada. No fold space adversary in this region of space had ever encountered it. The Pale Armada had not operated here. There was no way for the Dravathi to have a file on a force they had never encountered, and there was no way for them to know that their methodology of using fold events as weapons would, against this specific adversary, convert each attack into a targeting solution for a weapon that traveled through Dravathi fold space and destroyed Dravathi infrastructure. They could not know because the category of adversary that does this had no entry in any record they held, because no adversary they had ever faced could do it. 3 centuries of expansion, 31 fold events on the afternoon of day 63, and 11 coordinated fold nodes on the morning of day 64, and a total elapsed engagement time of approximately 20 hours, and the complete destruction of whatever Dravathi fold infrastructure had been committed to this corridor. I do not know how large a portion of the Dravathi continuance's regional capacity was committed to the 7th Passage District incursion. I have filed an information request with the Vethara Scientific Advisory Service on this question. The request is pending. The ICV Pale Watch will broadcast its identification signal in approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes by my calculation. I will log it as I log each broadcast. Timestamp, designation, status confirmed, standing orders active. 1 line, 20 seconds. I filed my 43rd daily administrative report batch this morning. 7 forms, standard categories, accurate figures. The corridor is functioning within recovery parameters. The restoration team is en route. The population is stable. The 5 folded transit lanes have a remediation timeline and an assigned team. In my administrative record, the 7th Passage District is a corridor in recovery from a resolved territorial incursion. In my incident log, the 7th Passage District is the corridor where 11,400 warships answered a form VRA-7, and 1 frigate stayed, and I have been filing follow-up inquiries for 31 days into a void that has not sent anything back. And I do not know who to thank, and I do not have a form for gratitude, and I am not certain that the force that sent 11,400 ships reads my follow-up inquiries at all. I want to say something about the Dravathi continuance that I find difficult to phrase in administrative language, and that I have been trying to phrase accurately for 31 days, because I think it is part of the record, even if it is not a part of the record that any standard form has a field for. The Dravathi were not, as best I could determine from 9 weeks of observation, acting in bad faith. They were not deliberately targeting 18,000 Vethara resettlement population residents or attempting to harm the people in this corridor. They were expanding. That is what the Dravathi continuance does. They identify space they want to incorporate into their territorial volume, and they fold it, and the populations and infrastructure of that space adapt to the new geometric reality, or they do not. The Dravathi do not appear to make a distinction between space that is unoccupied and space that is occupied. They fold both kinds. The occupants are a logistical detail of the incorporation process, not the target of it. I do not know whether to classify this as better or worse than targeting the occupants deliberately. I have thought about it. I have not reached a conclusion that satisfies me. I have filed it in the incident report under a category that covers both, because I do not have a separate category for each, and because the effect on the occupants is the same regardless of whether they were the target or the incidental consequence. The Pale Armada also did not, as best I could determine from what I observed, appear to be targeting the Dravathi as such. They targeted fold infrastructure. The infrastructure was destroyed. The Dravathi withdrew to whatever space they still held. I have no information about Dravathi casualties from the engagement, because I have no sensors capable of monitoring inside Dravathi territorial space, and no channel through which the Dravathi would report such information to me. What I know is what my scanner recorded, and my scanner recorded the destruction of fold infrastructure, and the cessation of fold events, and the departure of the Pale Armada. The corridor is quiet. The scan is clean. I do not know whether the Dravathi continuance will attempt another incursion into the 7th Passage District, once the Pale Armada has been absent long enough for the Dravathi to recalibrate their operational risk assessment. I have filed a standing monitoring request with the Regional Technical Support Desk, asking to be notified if any fold distortion signatures appear in the district's spatial margin. The request is in the queue. I expect it will be acknowledged within the standard window. I filed my 12th follow-up inquiry this morning. I asked again for the authorizing body identification. I asked again about the correct form. I noted that my 11 previous inquiries had not received responses, and I asked whether the inquiries were being received. This is not the kind of question I usually put into formal administrative correspondence, because it implies a failure in the system that I am part of, and that implication is not comfortable. I put it in anyway because accurate documentation is more important than comfort, and because the question needed to be part of the record regardless of whether anyone capable of answering it was reading. The response queue is empty. I will file again tomorrow. I file forms into whatever void the bureaucracy points me toward, without expectation, because I am an administrator and administrators file forms and maintain records, and the records are what exists after everything else is over. The record of what happened in the 7th Passage District on days 63 and 64 of the Dravathi incursion is complete and accurate, and will be here for whoever comes after, whether or not anyone in a position to respond to it ever reads any of my follow-up inquiries. The ICV Pale Watch is on station in the outer corridor margin. The scanner is running. The corridor is standard space, quiet in a way that I had stopped expecting it to be. The scanner is reading what it is supposed to read. The ICV Pale Watch will broadcast in an hour and 50 minutes. I will log the broadcast and complete the entry in 20 seconds and return to whatever form is next in my queue. I find, somewhat to my surprise, that this is sufficient. I had imagined, in the long middle weeks of the incursion, that what came after would need to be larger than this to feel like enough. But the corridor is quiet and the population is present and the restoration team is coming and the ICV Pale Watch is on station. And all of that together, logged carefully in the proper formats and submitted into the proper queues, constitutes a district that is functioning. I will keep filing the forms.